Now, the Rohingya, they've long faced persecution, but most recently, some 3 years ago, their plight reappeared on our television screens. Security forces in Myanmar are accused of killings, gang rape, arson during a crackdown that drove more than 730,000 people to flee Western Rakhine State for neighbouring Bangladesh. Myanmar has rejected most of those accusations, but hundreds of thousands of Rohingya who remain inside the country face systemic persecution, and they're living under the threat of genocide. That was the finding of a key United Nations fact-finding mission. Our next speaker was a key member of that UN panel, human rights lawyer Chris Sidoti. He's been an instrumental person in calling on the international community to take strong action to hold the perpetrators of violence accountable, and also to give neighbouring Bangladesh support to provide for the Rohingya refugees arriving across the border. So it's with a great anticipation and respect that I hand you over to Mr. Chris Sidoti.
Thanks, Darren, for the introduction. Like you, Darren, Jorge and David, I start by recognising that no matter where we are in Australia, we are meeting on the land of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I certainly honour those who are their custodians and their elders, today, yesterday and tomorrow. They have a rich history from which all of us who have come later benefit. And so I honour them and recognise their continuing responsibilities for our land. Late in October 2017, as a member of the United Nations fact-finding mission on Myanmar, I visited the Cox's Bazar area in Bangladesh. In this area, there are a number of camps, the largest refugee camp in the world, Kutupalong, amongst others. I spent a few days going through those camps and talking with the people who were there, listening to stories, listening to their stories. I spoke with women, men, and also with children. I heard their stories of what had happened during the weeks preceding their departure from Myanmar. These are Rohingya people, people who have long experienced persecution in the Western Rakhine State of Myanmar. The stories they told were truly horrific. They told of being forced from their homes, being forced out, accompanied by extreme violence committed against them, their families and their communities. I remember many of these stories, in so many respects, stories that are too horrific for me to go into, and I won't. But they were stories of extreme violence and grave suffering. I also remember vividly visits to children's safe spaces, conducted by UNICEF or a non-government organisation associated with UNICEF, where very young children, the age of my grandchildren, could meet and just play and enjoy life, but also record their experiences in drawing appropriate for children. And I sat with kids and I looked at the drawings that they had done, and I listened to them as they told me what the drawings meant and what they had experienced. Through those whose stories I listened to, the kids whose paintings I could see, I obtained a picture of what had happened. But more than just the numbers that I met and spoke with, were very large numbers that others on our team, the other members of the fact-finding mission, the staff who were working with us, were able to meet as well. In all, we conducted almost 1,300 interviews with victims of human rights violations in Myanmar. To be exact, 1,294. The most remarkable thing about these stories was their total consistency with each other. People were talking about the same experiences, even though they lived The experiences occurred significant distances apart. They provided us with a comprehensive picture of what had happened. They spoke about the deaths. We estimated that 10,000 was a very conservative estimate of the number of people who were killed between the 25th of August and the end of September 2017. A very conservative estimate. They spoke about the rapes. We have no idea how many women and girls, and also men and boys, were raped during the course of these operations. The one thing that struck me and my colleagues very forcefully was the way in which rape was accompanied by physical mutilation of the persons being raped. We'd not encountered such an experience previously. They spoke about the burnings. During those few weeks, 178 Rohingya villages were totally destroyed, and another 214 were partially destroyed. And they spoke about flight, fleeing from their homes and villages across northern Rakhine State and into the neighbouring country, Bangladesh. Those journeys themselves were often horrific journeys of being pursued by the military, people being killed along the way, hardship, hunger, thirst, before crossing into safety in Bangladesh. As I said, these stories were completely consistent with each other, which is always a test of truthfulness. Our courts here in Australia too will often look at the consistency of evidence as a means of determining what is true. But that was not good enough for the government and the military of Myanmar. These stories, and our report of the stories, received a response of denial, total denial. Yet we had no doubt whatsoever that what we were hearing was true. It's interesting that only last week, evidence has appeared in public for the first time from two former soldiers who fled the military, who spoke about their experiences during this period, and who confessed to serious crimes, including murder, rape, and burning. I knew from the beginning that eventually the truth would out from the other side, that is the side of the perpetrators. And now that's started to happen, and there'll be more. The stories that people tell are stories that are inherently believable. And the soldier's testimony now is simply confirmation of what people have always said. We heard stories from hundreds of people in those camps. But we all have stories, each of us. I have my own stories, including stories of the migration experience. My grandparents came from Italy and Greece. And as a child, I remember hearing their stories, and they've become part of my story as well. My great-grandfather came here at the age of 13, just over a century ago, on a boat. He was a boat person. He was 13. Today, we'd call him an unaccompanied minor. He came without a passport, without a visa. Those things weren't needed in those days. And he settled in this country, and he founded a dynasty. We're all here now, in not just dozens, but over hundreds of us. We all have our story. I've heard many stories in this country too about the experiences of people. I'm a human rights lawyer and always have been. So the stories that I've heard are often tragic stories. When I worked for the Australian Law Reform Commission, I sat for day after day and heard the stories of women and children who had been abused by their husbands and fathers. When I was a worker at the Human Rights Commission, I listened to the stories of Indigenous people who had been separated from their parents or whose children had been taken away from them. We all have our stories. The stories that I heard in the camps of Bangladesh were stories that are beyond the experience of the great majority of Australians. Certainly many of you who are participating today in the forum will have similar stories to tell about your own experiences. But for most of us Australians, this is a different world, a different scene. We don't know, and often we don't want to know. Through my work, I have been privileged to experience a little of the stories of people who come to this country. I have been many times to Sri Lanka. I have been many times to Afghanistan. I have been only once to Iraq. I have known people, friends, who have been murdered. I've known people, friends, who have disappeared. I've known too some of the messages that we Australians give to people who need us, who need our care and concern. On one visit to Kabul, I drove through one of the largest roundabouts in the city, and I saw this enormous billboard in the roundabout, a photo of a sinking boat. One of my Afghan friends translated the script to me. Basically, it said, "Don't try to come to Australia, you will die." I've seen a similar message and a similar picture on the homepage of the Australian High Commission in Bangladesh when I've been visiting Dhaka. "Don't try to come to Australia, you will die." Yes, boats sink. But this is not the message, as an Australian, that I like to see us giving those who need our help. These people are called queue jumpers, but there's no queue in Kabul. People cannot apply for migration to Australia directly from Afghanistan. People have stories. And these stories are continuing stories. And they are stories that occur in this country too. The story of Behrouz Boochani in his wonderful book, No Friend But the Mountains. This is a story that should strike at the heart of every Australian. The story of the Sri Lankan family with 2 little children locked up on Christmas Island now, as we meet today. And they've been there not just for over a month, but for over a year. The story in The Guardian this week from Mardin Arvin, who's locked up on the 3rd floor of a hotel in Brisbane, looking out at a world that he wonders whether he will ever experience. The stories of around 380 people who are still on Nauru and in Papua New Guinea at the behest of the Australian government. These stories continue. These are today's stories. My story, the story of my family, the story of your families, and these new stories deserve respect. That means 4 things. They deserve to be heard. People are entitled to have their experiences heard by others and understood by others. This forum is an excellent means of contributing to that. So too are great books like Behrouz Boochani's books and the writing of Mardin Arvin. The stories deserve to be heard. Second, they deserve to be heard with compassion. Compassion is a great value, probably the greatest of human values. In English, sometimes people see it as being patronising. But the Latin origins of the English word compassion mean suffering with. We need to hear stories in ways that cause us to suffer with those who tell the stories. The stories deserve to be believed. Too often, we in Australia approach people's stories with a sense of utter disbelief, suspecting people of lying to us for their own advantage. I'm an old man. My experience over decades of working in human rights is that when people tell the stories of what has happened to them, they tell the truth. And they are entitled to belief until it is proven otherwise, not the reverse. Not that they should have to establish what they have told us. We should start with belief unless there is evidence to the contrary. And finally, the stories deserve a response. Hearing is not enough. Feeling compassion is not enough. Believing is not enough. There is an entitlement to a response with belief, in compassion, having heard. We as a country are often very generous in our responses. The Australians of a century ago were very generous to my Greek and Italian grandparents, and today I have the benefit of that. But we lack in generosity so often. Things are being done in our name for which we share responsibility. The stories of people deserve respect, and that means they deserve response. I hope that one thing that comes out of today will be a greater commitment to respond with justice, with compassion, and with acceptance of more people into our community. Thank you.